First off, I want to say welcome to the Asking Different Questions research training series. Today we're going to be talking about studying race, sex, and gender. And as you know, my name is Sarah McCullough. I'm the Associate Director at the Feminist Research Institute. And this is a project that is funded by a National Science Foundation Innovations in Graduate Education grant. This series is part of a program hosted through the Feminist Research Institute, where we work to build more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. And the Asking Different Questions research training series is a key part of how we do that. And what we see this series doing is providing the intellectual foundations for just oriented STEM research. So today's agenda, we will start off by first going over some foundational concepts, providing a general introduction to how to think about race, sex, and gender, and then move into what'll be a fairly quick discussion, a very in-depth, but also fast discussion of how to study race, sex, and gender and questions that you will ask. I should say that what we're going to do today is far, far from exhaustive, but it's at least can hopefully give you all steps to think about where you can go for your particular field from there. We'll have, as always, some discussion questions that hopefully you can take offline or into other Zoom rooms with your colleagues, and then a short closing. Okay, so our foundational concepts today are sex, gender, and race. And I also want to highlight intersectionality because I think that's really important as how we think about all these. Really crucial in our thoughts about this is to recognize how race, sex, and gender are social constructs, that we as social beings decide how to make these divisions and make these matter. I think oftentimes it's easier for us to see how race or gender are socially constructive but we may think of sex as sort of like the more solid biological factor. And yes, sex is based in a sort of biological materiality often in our definitions. But I think if we look to examples such as the lived experience of people who are intersex and gender verification testing, within the Olympics, we can see how even sex is something that is defined based on human definitions, not necessarily some natural law. In the case of gender verification testing in the Olympics, really decades of work have shown that there are no one particular set of tests or traits that can definitively divide the entire human race into two sexes. The discourse around gender verification testing often is about fairness, but if we really look at it more deeply, we can see that it is also about policing the accomplishments of female identified athletes. So, which is how definitions of sex are being invoked, not necessarily through some sort of static factual it's always the same type of definition. And intersectionality actually also plays a role in when gender verification testing has been invoked in the Olympics. And similarly, it is highly relevant in our research to avoid a sort of like reductionistic approach and to actually account for the complexity of lived experience. So today I'm going to I'll let you all know that about 44% of you who are on this today are studying race, about 22% studying sex, 30% studying gender, and about 45% doing none of the above. So we're all coming in from, I think, really different places, which is exciting. And therefore, we bring different perspectives to these questions. We're obviously not going to discuss these right now, but I invite you all to take a moment to reflect on, if you do study race, sex, or gender, how were you taught to study these particular concepts? And what knowledge do you already have of how to study race, sex, and gender factors in your area of study? If the answer is not very much, this can help you to get an idea of where to start or where to go from there. Or if you already do, hopefully this can give you some ideas of how to study it with greater depth. So I want to say a little bit more about the interactions between race, sex, and gender. This is a graphic from a really wonderful paper by Stacy Ritz et al. And really, I will say it's really helpful for anyone who does basic lab sciences, as she raises the, I think, often really challenging question of what is the relevancy of race, sex, and gender when you're doing, basic lab research, basic experimental research. Um, but more broadly, what this graphic demonstrates is how sex and gender are constantly influencing and interacting with each other. And Fausto Sterling, another scholar of sex and gender, points out how traits like bone density, something that seems very like measurable, biological, is influenced by both things such as sex hormones, but also by gender dynamics such as dress, occupation, physical activity. She also points out how things like social relations can influence the function of hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal gland axes in response to stress. And so there are many things about our everyday interactions that directly influence biological factors that we generally map onto sex. Now, turning to race, um, I'm going to highlight here some interactions between race and technology and race in medicine. There are quite a number of technologies that all may not work well for those with darker skin. Soap dispensers, heart rate monitors, Apple Watches, pulse oximeters, all technologies that have not functioned as well on darker skin. There's been some really great research, particularly from a number of different scholars. I'll highlight one, a project called Gender Shades, that documented how AI technology cannot see Black women's faces because the system performs better both on men and lighter skinned people. This led to error rates of 35% for dark skinned women as opposed to 1% for light skinned men. So a really radical difference in the capacity of facial recognition technology. If we look to medical care, there's some really increasingly robust research coming out demonstrating that Black mothers are more likely to die in childbirth or suffer complications, and research studying the very complex reasons for this. We can also look at research on coming out about how Black boys and girls are more likely to be treated as adults or held inappropriately inappropriately responsible for behavior, labeled as deviant, autistic, put into adult wards perhaps, assumed that the violence that they suffered was somehow deserved. And these are sort of attitudes that often can make their way into the way that race is studied as well. Taking a sort of like deficit approach is an example of this. So with those examples in place, I want to move into a sort of process that one can move through to think about how to decide how they can best study gender, sex, and race in their research or other aspects of identity. I want to acknowledge Kara Tannenbaum and Londa Scheibinger, who authored a paper in Nature, Sex Gender Analysis, Improved Science and Engineering, from which much of this material is, it should credit. And this particular graphic is from a talk they gave through Elsevier's Research Academy. And I highly recommend looking at both of those sources for more information on these topics. So what you see here is different components that can go into making up sex and gender and other sort of intersectional identities that may apply to the research that you're doing. What this really illustrates is that if you are studying sex or if you are studying gender, race, it's really important to get specific. And I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, because when you study sex, oftentimes there is one particular aspect of what we have defined as sex that will be most relevant to your research. And so it's important to think about what is the specific aspect that you are thinking of. And it is often important to also think about how that specific aspect, say of sex, say hormonal milieu is what you really want to look at, how that may also be influenced by gender and race or other sort of social identities. That may not necessarily be the focus of your study because one study can't do everything, but it's important to keep those things in mind. Here's some suggestions of a process that you can go through when thinking about your research design. First, what does the existing literature say? Many if one hasn't been trained in how to explicitly how to study race, sex, or gender, it's easy to say, well, there's not much in my field about this, or this doesn't feel as relevant. But it's always good to check, because there may be some really interesting research out there of which you're unaware. Two, what sites of difference might matter? So again, going back to the previous slide and something I'll show you in a moment, what do you think is relevant? You may already have evidence of this based on existing research or early observations, but think about what you can study and what is most relevant. Two, ask yourself, do I have adequate representation, or how do I get adequate representation? Now, I'm going to point out two areas here. One is in research design. As we've talked about in other sessions, we all are always bringing our own life experiences into our research practices. And if, say, we are studying a particular phenomenon that is, we want to think about a phenomenon in a particular heterogeneous way, and our research community, our research lab is particularly homogeneous, we should take that into account and think about how we can diversify the research team, how we can bring in different perspectives that may not currently be there, and address maybe why the research community is as homogeneous as it is. Two, we should also think about representation in terms of sampling. Do we have the ability to reach the communities that are necessary to study the phenomena in the way that we want? And if not, how can we make that happen? And this can often be much more complex than just reaching out to a new population. Some populations, for example, some populations have not necessarily been treated well by medical research historically, or even in some examples in the present. And this may affect their willingness to participate in future research projects. And this needs to be accounted for and thought about in the ways that we decide and determine how we will get adequate representation. After that, you can also think about, how can I most accurately account for difference? So what aspects of the socially constructed nature of difference is most likely to matter, and what cultural context may matter? Again, these may not all end up making it into your research design, but to really think about it and hone in on exactly what you're doing. And this will matter later on as well when we get to analysis. And finally, obviously, for your field, select the most appropriate methodologies. So thinking about ways that difference can matter, I just kind of wanted to highlight, this is far from exhaustive, but it's just a way to begin your thinking. If you're studying gender, what really is it about gender that matters? And again, you may not know this at the beginning. This may be something that comes in both at the research design level and at the level of analysis. So maybe gender is mattering because of social roles, perhaps because of social relations, because of the way we are socialized into the world, because of institutional norms, or even perhaps because of the interactions that individuals are having with researchers. Again, we don't leave our identities at the door. The bodies and the socialization that we walk into a research experiment with is not left behind and may impact the results we get. And that's not necessarily something that we can do away with. The fact is, I mean, being social beings, that's sort of impossible. What we can do is we can account for it and think about it. And the more that we account for it, the more accurate our research results can be. In thinking about sex, we talked about this again a little bit, but again, thinking about issues of, environments, genetics, hormones, chromosomal. Are we talking about, bone density, skeletal structure, musculature? And again, researcher interactions can also have an impact here. And finally, thinking about race, we'll see some of the same sorts of things. We'll see environment, treatment by others, including the researcher interaction, or their treatment by others in other settings, which we have really ample evidence that people are treated differently by race. Skin color may be relevant, physical characteristics may be relevant, algorithmic bias may be relevant, as well as other factors. So now we move into questions of analysis. So presumably you move through your research process, you have some data. How do you analyze this? What are some questions that you should be sure to ask? One, do differences emerge when data is disaggregated? So one, having the tools and the capacity so you can disaggregate your data. I highly advocate for using tools that allow for an intersectional analysis. So you can look not just at so you have the capacity to study both sex and gender or sex and race or gender and race simultaneously if possible. And this is something that can be good to do even if this isn't the focus of your study. And so you may not actually be studying sex difference, but it is still worthwhile to do the disaggregation just to see if anything's there. And then you can ask yourself, what is the source of this difference? Do I actually have the data to answer that question? The answer may be yes, or the answer may be no. And I think it is very important to be very honest at this point. I think it can oftentimes be tempting to overstate in this particular area and in the question of why. So but do ask the question. And if you do speculate, be very clear about that speculation, what assumptions are grounding that speculation. Similarly, you would do that when you're studying why differences are surfacing. These are really important questions, but they're also really, these are the types of questions where it can be really easy to fall into bias, to fall into reinforcing gender stereotyping. It's also important to account for the degree of overlap across difference. Sometimes we get so caught up in finding difference that we actually don't account for the similarities. But this is also highly relevant and highly important. Think about how might researcher bias be a factor. At this point, I'd recommend do this throughout your process. It can be really great to get outside perspective and ask people explicitly, hey, can you tell me if you think that, I might have some bias in my analysis here. And how might systems of power be a factor? Here, I would highlight are people telling you or exerting pressure, whether through funders, through your research community, to come up with particular findings, and try and be honest about that as well. So you've done your analysis, now you're doing your write-up, moving towards reporting. Report differences and similarities. So again, coming back to that analysis, even if studying differences wasn't the focus of your study, still say that, even if it is just like a very simple statement of this particular sex difference was apparent and this is how we defined sex. Null findings are also incredibly important here. So if you do not find difference, if you find those similarities, also report that. Explain the underlying mechanisms if you have the data to back it up. Or if you are sort of moving into the area of potential future research and you have some suggestions of where people may look for the underlying mechanisms, again, be really clear about any assumptions that you're building into that, or back that up with other research and examine, does that other research have any biases from which I should be particularly cautious? Suggest ways to mitigate any biases or inequities that you do identify. So if your findings may be due to certain social inequities, be very clear about that. And I think that's particularly important because research has often had an emphasis to point towards the responsibility of the individual. and not necessarily point towards systemic issues. And so it's important to make sure that we are accounting for the various levels from which bias or inequity may be surfacing. Therefore, attend to both individual and systemic issues. Be very careful, as I've been saying, not to overstate any implications and be mindful of reinforcing stereotypes, even if unintentionally. And I think this is also important as you think about not just what you are writing, but thinking about how your research may travel in the world beyond your particular authored paper. I think we've all seen examples of studies where if you go back to the original peer-reviewed source, it may seem like a very tempered finding, but the way it gets popularized in media, obviously we can't control, but it can be something we can think about and imagine, and that may influence the way that we write up the data. So that's a lot of information, and I imagine it may be helpful to come back to that. I highly recommend coming back to some of those sources I mentioned earlier. But questions that you can ask to move forward, I mean, other than just moving through this process, is what categories of difference do matter most in your area of research? And in what ways do these types of difference matter? You can ask yourself, do my methods allow me to study this different? And if not, what could I do? This could also give rise to maybe some really interesting new types of collaborations with disciplines outside your own. You can have a really honest conversation with yourself or perhaps your research colleagues about what biases might impact your research, both on the personal level within your field of study. Does your field of study have certain assumptions that may be influenced by social norms, as well as just societal norms that may also influence any research findings you have? So, some takeaways I hope everyone can move out of this session with is one, that race, sex, and gender are applicable for all human research and many non human research projects. If you are studying humans, race, sex, and gender are extremely likely relevant in some form or another, or if they are not, we should know that and we should have some really solid evidence for how and why. It is incredibly important to take an intersectional and context-driven approach, that this can lead to more accurate research. Not all women are the same, not all men are the same. The places, the experiences, the lives that we have may change research results. So again, be very specific to a context you are studying. If your entire data set is college students, that's relevant, and should be revealed and should be accounted for. And finally, I'd encourage you all to think about how you can identify allies and tools that you may need to study race, sex, and gender with greater precision. Sometimes in fields where doing this work may be less well established, or in fields where it may be a new area of study, it can be helpful to say, okay, who's on my team in this? Who else thinks this is important? Because there may be others in your field, maybe others with in more positions of power that may not think this is important, or that this research may challenge existing assumptions. And that is a really exciting place to be. And depending where you're at in your career, that can also be a little bit of a challenging or scary place to be. And so the more allies you can have, the more you can form a community around doing this type of research, the greater strength you can have. Who can back you up? If you're at a conference and you want to ask that question, is there someone there who can say, yes, I agree, this is an issue? That can only build your own confidence and build your own capacity to be able to do this work and have this work be seen as legitimate. So I thank you all. I hope this has been helpful. Next week, we will be studying making more accurate knowledge. I hope you can all join us. And I invite you all to take part in this closing poll. I'd love to hear if you think that this will be helpful in your research down the road. Okay, so take care and have a good rest of your week. Hope to see you next week.